Part of why Starcraft appeals to the male psyche is it's a lot like Dragon Ball Z, where guys, even if they're in teams, they send out 1v1 representatives to do honorable battle, and then whenever the match is concluded, they go on to the next one. And this was done most frequently in the Brood War Pro League. This was just a staple over in Korea. This was highly rated on Korea television. This was more popular in Korea than the individual star leagues, like the OSL and MSL and like the ASL now. OSL and MSL back then, ASL now, and leagues like the GSL. As you see Jaedong there, the Tyrant, an incredible player, and this is him at the peak of his powers. So in these Pro League matches that were just viewed at a tremendous level and cared about immensely in Korea, almost more than the individual leagues, because remember, like, Kespa had huge control over these guys' lives, and from Kespa's point of view, it was like cooler for them, like as SKT or KT Rolster, whatever the team might be, to win the Pro League. That's better for them as the team than it is for one of their players to win an individual Star League. So Pro League was a huge deal, and this one occurred in early 2011. And remember, Wings of Liberty came out in summer of 2010, and the God tier Kespa Koreans just weren't allowed to switch over. The B teamers and sort of the lower rung A team guys, they were allowed to go over to Wings of Liberty, but it wasn't until Heart of the Swarm that Bisu, Stork, Flash, Jaedong, Rain, these guys switched over. Some of them started like at the very last GSL in Wings of Liberty, but the full switch didn't occur until the first Heart of the Swarm GSL. So what's interesting about this match is Fantasy is on an absolute rampage. He's up 3-0. This is the King of the Hill style best of 7 Pro League format that everybody's used to and loves. So Fantasy has absolutely butchered Jaedong's teammates here. And this is a break glass in case of emergency type scenario for Jaedong's team. This is like when the bases are loaded in a one-run game in the 8th inning and you have to bring in your closer. Did you want to bring in your closer in the 8th inning with the bases loaded and no one out? No. You wanted to bring him in up with the lead in the 9th. Jaedong's team wanted to use him whenever they were up to secure a victory, you know what I mean? They don't want to have to use their ace down 0-3, but this is what happens when somebody's on a rampage and you have a great player at the peak of their powers playing really well, as Fantasy absolutely on fire today. And I picked this match out of the best of 7 because it's sort of the culmination, flashpoint, turning point of the series, and it represents one of the coolest things about the Brood War Pro League, which is the ability for a guy who's red hot to just face everyone, take on all the challengers, be able to say, look, I'm on fire, you know what map it's on, you have a whole roster of guys to pick my weak matchup, and hit me with your best shot, kiddo. Because every StarCraft player, except for probably Flash, has a weak matchup. You know, even if you're really good at all 3 matchups and you're like a Gosu or a Bonjour level player even, you're going to have a matchup that's your worst. Typically, a StarCraft player will have one matchup that they're famous for, that they're really good at, and then sometimes the other 2 matchups won't be as good, or one will be good and then they'll have an Achilles heel matchup. Let me give you some examples. The StarCraft 2 God tier French Zerg player Stefano was known for his Zerg vs Protoss when he was at the peak of his powers around this era in 2011-2012, as you see a hatch come down for the Dong. And Stefano had terrible Zerg vs Zerg, and basically Stefano was plagued with being a European Zerg and just a region full of great Zergs like Nerchio and a Laser, and these guys that were just always Vortex at the time, who were just always freaking knocking him out in Zerg vs Zerg when he could beat the best Korean Protosses like MC and could go toe-to-toe with the best Korean Zergs, which was almost unheard of for a foreigner. But everyone knew Stefano for his vs Zerg matchup when he was in his prime in 2011 and 2012. Another good example is Stork. Stork is a guy known for his vs Terran matchup, and his vs Zerg was pretty weak. Now, if we look at the guys on our screen right now, Fantasy and Jaedong, both of these guys are known for their ZVT. Jaedong was known as a guy who was god tier with the Muta and almost pioneered how great you could be with the Muta and how great you could micro Mutas and how much worth you could get out of them. And Fantasy was just a very crisp, methodical, intelligent macro player with very clean mechanics. Just a very copyable, intelligent Terran. And when I say copyable, I don't mean to say what he did was easy or his style was easy. I just mean to say that he played straight up. But he played in a very technical way. He played in a way that utilized micro. He played in a way that didn't really take a lot of economic risks. He played in a way that relied more on surprises and executing pushes. If you want to use like a down and dirty example, think about like the North American Terran Ruff. He's a guy who relies on cute little build orders or ideas more than necessarily getting ahead macro-wise. Although obviously Fantasy's macro is very good and Ruff's Achilles heel is his macro. I wish I could take Ruff, the creative North American Terran player, and give him like Idra's macro, or just Idra's mechanics, you know. And whenever Ruff's doing these like insane like PF Reaper rushes, instead of floating 1,000 at home, he has 2 bases mining. You know, a base mining and a third almost done. And a ton of production. I just think Ruff is so creative, but whenever I watch him it's brutal because it's like I'm watching him float so much money. And I just wish that his macro was really good because I think he'd be like an absolutely ridiculously hard opponent to prepare for. And whenever you talk about opponents that are hard to prepare for, that was one thing you had to deal with in Pro League because you had what you would call snipers, where there would be guys on a roster, say you would have like 8 or 10 guys that would go to the studio to play in Pro League. You have 1 or 2 of those guys who are never going to have like any individual Star League success and are only really good at one matchup, and it was usually a mirror matchup. So what would happen, there was a guy on SKT that would play in this series named S2, and like S2 was a Zerg player who like never won any individual Star Leagues or had any individual Star League deep runs, but was really good at ZVZ. So what would happen in Pro League was that SKT would have games where they would lose and their best player would lose, and then the other team would be on an absolute run with a player like Savior, July Zerg, or Jaedong, and they would be like, alright S2, go get him, go beat him in ZVZ, and they would try to use the incredibly volatile and tricky Zerg versus Zerg to get the god tier Zergs out of the rotation, eliminate them, and then sort of kill the carries, so to speak. It would be like if you were fighting the Z fighters and you were able to incapacitate Goku. It's like, well, we can like deal with the rest of Jaedong's team, but like, though S2 was a sniper player, and you often would hear this phrase used in Pro League to describe guys who were good at one matchup, or the whole purpose on the team was to kill, they call it killing, but like to defeat one player. Like, okay, like your job, S2, is whenever Jaedong beats Savior, or excuse me, whenever Jaedong beats Fantasy or one of our other best players and then beats someone else, we'll put you in to beat him in ZVZ. And Jaedong was known as a guy who was great in ZVZ, but again, ZVZ a very volatile mirror matchup. Mutas are out here along with Lings, as this has been a pretty standard macro game so far. A little bit of Medic Bio up here, Medic Marine, being flanked here. Lings leading. It's very intelligent here just to take pot shots with the Mutas as you lead with the Lings, because the Terran player just wants to focus the Muta. That's all they want to do is trade out Muta there. So great micro by Jaedong to flank up with the Lings. Now frequently in this matchup we see the Zerg player sort of hen-pecking away at the Terran bio, and anytime the Terran bio moves, the Zerg player wants to force them to stem. They want to attack it, they want to pick, they want to be irritating. And that happens through the middle of the map a lot, but it's one of these unspoken things that needs to be pointed out, where if you can have an engagement where you're destroying the Terran player with Lings, and then your Mutas have impunity to do whatever they want, and the Lings are there sponging for them, that's what you want. As you see Jaedong sort of being sandwiched a bit there by Fantasy, who deflects his Muta harass and really wants to kill that annoying Overlord. Because that Overlord up on that little high ground gives Jaedong vision of where Fantasy's army is moving. So if Fantasy moves out to his third, that little 6 o'clock base at the bottom to try to secure it, Jaedong's going to knife in and try to kill the turrets. So that's a dynamic of harassing with mutas, where the Zerg always wants to sort of have scoped up eyes on the Terran army, and then they can attack with the muta accordingly. That's one thing about Starcraft 2 that you never saw Zergs do enough, was have a changeling with the Terran army. I mean, even at like Masters level, like this is something that doesn't get done enough. Because you see pro gamers just not use changelings at all, and you can use them all the time. You make a couple overseers, you have one in your army, you drop the changeling. They're for more than just scouting. That's one thing in StarCraft 2 that just never got enough play. Because if you use them consistently and irritatingly enough, the Terran player is not always going to be able to kill them. So you can stick a changeling marine, just have it right clicked on a marine in the main Terran army, and fly around with your muta. And we saw sort of the Brood War version where Jaedong had an overlord on the high ground spotting. Another thing Zergs didn't do enough in StarCraft 2 were burrowed banelings. A lot of that has to do with creep spread, like Terran's going to be scanning already to clear out the creep spread, but that was one thing I've heard Artosis talk about multiple times, like over the course of 12 years, was like burrowed banelings. Like, it surprises me Zergs don't do that more. Remember that era when you could cast spells with the burrowed infester? Zergs just like didn't abuse that, and it got patched out like a year later, but like, you know, Zerg should have never lost a tournament in that span. That was one of the dumbest patches ever. Jaedong flying in here, known for his incredible muta micro, skirting in, but the first vessel comes out. So that's sort of a big power spike for Terran, that first vessel. But Fantasy's very tight, clustered up base here, which is very, very good against Ling run-bys, is one of those things that makes it hard to defend mutas whenever the Zerg does manage to get up there. Jaedong burrowing lurkers up on the high ground. He's bringing the hammer down on Fantasy, microing around with the mutas, and notice he's waiting for his Lings before he really does anything. Surging in with lurkers is the Tyrant. A bunch of bio goes down, a scan occurring, but to what end? As most of the Terran army gets butchered, but a lot of it remains. One tank remains as well. So a nice little engagement occurring, a very bloody engagement. That's one thing about Brood War, is you can see a crazy engagement like that where both players lose a lot of value units. Like, the game's not over. If you look at a game like StarCraft 2, like, oh, he lost, 4 lurkers and a bunch of muta, like, the game would be over. I think that's part of the beauty of Brood War, is it's so hard to macro, getting your stuff from point A to point B, making stuff without multiple building select, constantly making workers without auto mine. These things are so difficult that it's just difficult to close a game, even if you're a top-end Korean pro gamer. It's not as simple as hitting F2 and doing a warp-in cycle with the warp prism. I think like StarCraft 2, in Wings of Liberty the pace was pretty good, but it got to the point where it was more and more and more as we see lurkers burrow. But with vessels and tanks out, Jaedong will actually reposition southbound. I thought he was going to retreat, but he's going to try to snipe the tanks. And I love how he uses those pillars in the middle. He used those pillars in the middle to create a choke point, and he's going to run in with lurkers and run in with more lurkers and do a bit of a sandwich here. And notice how Jaedong's using lurkers incredibly well, and not just running them all in at once, but he's using Lings to sponge damage. So many Zerg players in that situation would have just moved all the Lings in while they moved their lurkers around. Guess what? It makes it easy for Terran to push and clear your lurkers when they have no support and they have a vessel there. But the way that Jaedong microed his Lings maximized the amount of space that he created for his lurkers, and we can see the Dong shutting down a drop here from Fantasy. Couple Scourge coming in and clearing that up. Remember, no Ignite Afterburners in StarCraft 1, which Ignite Afterburners were really just a terrible patch. I remember like people booing them in MLG Dallas, the first major LAN with Heart of the Swarm. Like, people stupidly thought that they were booing the pro gamers, but like, Terran was so strong, as you see lurkers coming in here, going for a droopy flank, and Lings screaming southbound, and Fantasy being outmaneuvered on the middle of the map by Jaedong. But the Ignite Afterburners was just reviled when it first came in the game. Just seen as sort of like a stupid, tawdry, gimmicky thing. And it was very frustrating to see, wow, a huge blood splatter there. Terran run around with impunity and be able to pick up and run away constantly. Now, it made for really exciting ZVTs in terms of action and constantly attacking, but it felt like it cheapened the risk of like medevac and dropship play. And when you're making mass medevac in StarCraft 2 anyway. Shit, Marine King was famous for just floating his factory right out the gate, making a second starport and making like 30 medevacs. Look at the medic in StarCraft 1. It's like a clunky, dumb unit that you have to just create a control group for and move along, and essentially your opponent can easily do tactics like plague and muta-harass to get it to drain energy, and it doesn't serve any utility purpose. All it does is heal, right? Well, look at the medevac. Like, the medevac is better than the medic is at healing, and it can pick your units up and do drop play. As we see, Jaedong has control of that high ground with lurkers. Well, drop play is one of the best things in StarCraft because you can force your opponent to multitask and circumvent static defense and mines and stuff like this. So people really didn't understand how good the medevac was in StarCraft 2. They didn't appreciate it. And then when Boost came out in Heart of the Swarm, it was ridiculous in ZBT. That was one of the times where Zerg had it worst. As you see Jaedong fanning out here, getting lurker control. Notice how he always has lings with lurkers. He's so smart about moving his control groups around and not just having all my lurkers on one hotkey. I was talking to Gypsy today, the American Tyrant on Twitch TV, and he was talking about how, like, in a late game ZVT as Zerg, you want to have a defiler, like, on control groups like 1, 2, 3, and 4, like, have a defiler on army hotkeys. Whereas I'm a StarCraft 2 player, so I always thought, like, oh, like, infestors, I want to have all my spellcasters on one key. And Gypsy was saying, no, it's not really like that. In StarCraft 1, it's more about spreading out your spellcasters, because remember, there's no smart casting. Whereas, like, think about on StarCraft 2, you have 10 infestors on a control group. You hit F and click once, they'll cast one spell. If you do that with defilers, they'll cast 10 plagues. Like, every one of them will cast a plague because there's no smart casting. So having them all together is less of a big deal micro-wise. And him saying that, like, really makes a lot of sense in retrospect. But it's interesting to note that, like, I was Masters in StarCraft 2 with all 3 races, and I'm trying to learn Brood War, and it's way harder because so many of the core macro mechanics are different. I'm trying to do stuff in StarCraft 2 fashion in Brood War that doesn't work. In the beginning of StarCraft 2, for like, from the launch or from the beta to like mid-2011, we saw people just doing the stuff that they did in Brood Wars. We see the Nidus go down, that's huge, but with the Sunk in there, the damage won't be cataclysmic. But we saw Zergs just conga lining stuff out of the hatcheries and not hotkeying eggs. We saw them even putting hatcheries on separate keys or not hotkeying their hatches at all. Just like doing stuff like hotkey and queens, or like they wouldn't use all the camera hotkeys. They would not either use none or use only the 3 that they used in Brood War. So whenever I started playing StarCraft 2, I started doing the macro in the way that was the best for StarCraft 2, like hotkeying eggs and using freaking 7 or 8 camera hotkeys in macro games. Well, when you go back to Brood War, like, I'm playing Zerg macro games and I'm hitting freaking F5 trying to get to my 5th base because I have 10 years of muscle memory built up. And a huge plague goes down there on the Marines, pretty much stymieing the push, because when the Marines go down to 5 HP, the lurker spawn trying to go up a ramp is going to destroy them. So Jaedong just completely stymies that push. Beautiful use of the Defiler, which of course is the bread and butter unit of this matchup. It looks like Fantasy is going into full-blown freaking mech here. And this is something that sort of became popular in like 2018 and fell off a little bit, but it's just such an undertaking and so difficult. And you got to remember, like, just how hard it is to actually get the build. Oh, huge blood splatter there. But you got to remember how hard it is just to get the buildings to do what you want them to do in Brood War. Like, just to get the SCVs to make buildings next to each other without them bugging out is a big pain in the ass. So whenever you were considering watching Brood Wars, we see another nice defense there. You gotta consider whenever they're doing certain strats, or you see like 12 lings with lurkers, like, they have highly limited control groups. They don't have auto mine. Doing anything in Brood War is a huge uphill battle mechanically. So to say like, oh, he's doing a mech switch. Like in StarCraft 2, I just like control click all my barracks, hit L, like box a bunch of SCVs, hit VF and then like click them onto the existing factories holding or the existing tech lab and reactors holding shift. Like I've got mech in a minute and a half if I had an armory. In this game, first of all, like there is no tech lab transfer, so you've got to like, oh herp derp, like wait for the facts to finish, then go machine shop, then go upgrades. It's way more of an undertaking. A full-blown mech switch is just ludicrously difficult. I wonder if in 2011 it was a thing at all, and it sort of looked like with how many facts he was making, he was going to do it, but I wonder if he's just going to keep the remaining bio he has and make a little bit more with the barracks that he still has remaining. So spider mines all over the map, and this is one of the ways that you can sort of limit Zerg's map control and them just surging all over and surprising you. There's a bunch of lurkers come down. They're going to try to focus fire the tanks. Dark Swarm comes down too, and Jaedong gets another Dark Swarm down. Man, this is peak Jaedong, as he's not only defending everything perfectly, but playing aggressively in a really decisive and elegant way. And whenever people think about Jaedong in his prime, people think about absolute decisiveness and like really ruthless precision. Fantasy, with this many tanks, it looks like he's saying, okay, well, like, bio's not going to be much good against Ultra Dark Swarm Crackling, so I guess we'll try to make mech units. He's floating his science facility, praying to God that he rams those Scourge into it. But here we go, the Marines trying to defend the vessels, and they do. And with that barracks being floated, I think we can assume it's full-blown mech. Vultures up here at the top, and it's just a lot harder to observe Brood War, especially when I don't have access to the replays, and there's no production tab, and oftentimes the Korean observer is like intentionally not showing like side bases and production facility to like quote-unquote build tension, and like they don't have the supply up here. It's different than a Starcraft 2 game where you're casting 90% of it from the production tab. Like if I'm casting this, like Artosis famously once said, like I can cast like the first 10 minutes of a Starcraft 2 game just off the production tab. Like Starcraft 1's not like that, and the macro is so much harder. As you see a drop here, it's harder to predict what's going on. As Ultra drop here, circumventing the annoying little ramp and just crushing Fantasy. And if you're a newbie Zerg player, you've probably lost 60 supply in one battle trying to go up ramps like that. Jaedong not only circumvents the ramps with ultras, but has defilers there waiting in the retreat path and in the reinforcement path of Fantasy. So we're seeing like classic, decisive, brilliant tactical Jaedong here as he hammers that base, tries to keep the vessel count down with Scourge. Of course, there's 2 Scourge to kill a vessel. And just like versus Terran for just like against Protoss, the Terran doesn't want to make Goliath. So if you're wondering like, oh, like a couple Scourge, a couple Overlord, like why doesn't it have Goliath? Because the Goliath are bad against everything else. They want to go pure Vulture Tank. That's like Terran's dream, Vulture Tank. And of course Vessel, which is used to combat Tier 3 Zerg. Which is why you see Jaedong constantly mixing in Scourge and going out of his way to really limit the vessel count, because limiting the vessel count is really what this matchup comes down to if you're Zerg, and so much of that is Defiler micro. Okay, I'm gonna annoying Dark Swarm here, burrow some lurkers at this base, get him to lift. I'll have a Dark Swarm ready here at this base if he tries to attack it. I have a Plague ready here at his rallying army. I'll get a Plague on his whole army. Like, Zerg can win the war of attrition versus Terran if they limit their side bases and use drop well. If Terran gets more bases than Zerg and has mech and is sniping drones with vultures, then Terran can win. But we see here a bulldog maneuver on top of the siege tanks, ultras being dropped all over the mech, and this is how you play against mech, folks, with dropping all over it. And going back to the Starcraft 1 thing, you can see why Zergs in Starcraft 2 thought the answer to mech was to like drop roaches on it, because Jaedong punched out a bunch of tanks there and didn't get a Dark Swarm down until a significant time after he lost a bunch of the ultras. So it was a nice little chip there from the Dong, but it's not a killing blow. And again, Overlords moved around, but with turrets out, he's going to lose some supply. And even if you're ahead of Zerg, if you keep bleeding units, if you lose a bunch of Overlords and you gotta remake them, that really stalls your macro. Because it's like, not only do you have to make a bunch of dumb Overlords that you didn't want to waste money on, you're having to wait the whole like 25 seconds in Brood War, which is like a breathtakingly long time, it feels like, at least when you're playing Zerg. Which, by the way, the Overlord takes longer than the Pylon and the Depot. It certainly felt like it, and I looked it up and it was true. Classic Zerg stuff, throw some Darkstorm down, pick up the stuff under it, but don't go crazy overextending. Make more units, consume, get energy on your Defilers, get ready to throw more Darkstorm down. There it is. There it is, there it is. Darkstorm on top of the tanks, Ultras crushing down, the vessels can't really do much. When you're getting hammered with Ultras like this, and it's like, what do? Irradiate the Ultras so my units like have irradiate damage on them. And to salt the wound, Jaedong kills the vessel. Crazy stuff there. He's just been keeping the vessel count down all game. The nightmare for Zerg is they get like 10 vessels and they're just running around like irradiating everything. Like your Lurkers, your Defilers, they're erasing your mineral line. That's the nightmare for Zerg, and Jaedong has certainly done everything he can to make sure that doesn't happen, constantly limiting the vessel count. I don't think we've seen more than 5 vessels here for Fantasy. Fantasy, after going into the signature full-blown mech switch, has done some decent things mid-map with tanks, done a lot of nice mine placement, spider mines all over the map. Notice he has a few medics in his mineral line to help backstabs. And I like this. He needs to be doing more of this, the vultures, but you've got to understand, Jaedong's map control is crazy. His APM is off the charts. He's at the peak of his powers, so when you try to do these vulture moves, nice little friendly fire there, when you do these vulture moves, Jaedong not only is probably going to defend it, but immediately counterattacks. Like, look at this, like the vulture nonsense didn't even finish before Jaedong was up his ass doing big damage. There's a reason they called this guy the Tyrant. And like, I feel like a lot of people in Starcraft 2 expected him to win 4 GSLs, and that didn't happen, but it's not like any of those people ever went back and watched the Brood War replays. Shit, like I know if I didn't do it, like the average normie fan wasn't doing it. So that's part of why I do this in his classic series. Like, you hear about the Tyrant Jaedong, like I want to see him at the peak of his powers. How good really was he? Because the ASL is still going on, Brood War is still relevant to this day, it's still the best esport. So you can go back and watch these old VODs and see how good he was. I'm like, yeah, he was freaking insane. We can see him fighting against a Terran who just massacred 3 of his allies. He's trying to fight here to stop a sweep all-kill. Fantasy's given it everything he has, a droopy plague there on the Vultures. You love to see that. And the Defiler freaking Dark Swarms and saves himself. Love that. And we're seeing one of the most important ways to fight against mech, Jaedong, showing it's the Overlord and drop play, circumventing the siege tank line, and we can see the Vultures just getting eaten up there after taking severe plague damage. Knowing that they were gonzo, basically, Fantasy sent them in to harass. An insane amount of spider mines out. This is what you want to do if you're a mech player in any matchup, even against Toss. Litter the map with spider mines. Like if your opponent's just going to attack across the ground without detection, it should be an insane loss for them. And Jaedong sees that Fantasy is buttoned up, and he has a turret there as well as a little bit of bio. And one of the dynamics that Jaedong is trying to play out a bit here is I have drop, and I don't think you're going to go Goliath, and if you make any, you're going to want to make a bare minimum amount. As you see, wow, Ultra's being dropped into a minefield here, trying to crush the Vultures, and Fantasy sort of deduced what was coming and had a plethora of mines laid. But Jaedong, knowing that his opponent doesn't want to make Goliath, is sitting there saying to himself, okay, well, I can just sort of fly around with impunity. And Fantasy saying, if I spend, you know, a minute and a half making Goliaths out of all my factories, I'm not going to have enough Vulture tank to hold this like insane Defiler Ultraling army from the Tyrant. The Fantasy in his own regard, playing at the top of his game, being absolutely terrifying and on a roll, has been sort of on the back foot. You know, he's the mech player, he's defending, but a lot, oh, we see irradiates here on the Ultras, this is what I was talking about. And this is how you want to do it. The Ultras are way out on the middle of the map, they're not encroaching on you. And again, this is what you want to do as Zerg too. If you have a unit that gets irradiated and it's going to die, like, get value out of it. And for the love of God, get it out of your freaking army. For the love of God, keep your clothes on. But vultures are going to go up into the 1 o'clock base and try to kill some drones, but notice that there's a Sunken there, there's a Nidus there, there are Lings there that weren't being microed for a second. Even Jaedong isn't perfect, but Jaedong has checked all the boxes, he has dotted all of his I's, and this is something that all the intelligent macro players do, where they're very hard to backstab. Like a greedy player, and I hate to like use him as an example, but he did play like this in such a polarizing way where it is a good example. Look at a guy like Combat X, who, like, even though he would do aggressive early game cheeses, he would play in the most abusive way possible, and that included eco cheeses. Like Combat X would just take like a bunch of bases on the map, and he would famously shit talk at the end of the game, killing his opponents, and say like 12 minutes in the game, like, I'm on 6 base. Like, he would get a little bit of an edge, keep his opponent on the back foot, and just super aggressively expand behind it. Didn't have cannons at those bases, didn't have shit for defense, wasn't scouting that it was a good idea, he was just trying to get tempo in the game and mass expanding behind it, and then if that doesn't get scouted and accounted for after about 4 minutes, suddenly you have like an insurmountable eco advantage. And that sort of reflects into this game because Jaedong isn't playing like that. It's like every base he has is really well defended, and on some level, whenever you play Starcraft, everyone is going to have a little bit of that Combat X in them, at least if you're playing correctly and not just cheesing, where like you take a base and you are in a position where after you take a base, you can take another one and sort of incur an economic advantage. And Jaedong knows that, and he has fastidiously buttoned up every one of his bases, as we see Dark Swarm coming out here, and Lings at the top of the map, Irradiate coming down, and he's going to try to pull that weak Ultra away. Notice more bases coming out for the Dong. Fantasy swings northbound, he finally is around max, and he's trying to complete the all-kill. And he's tired of defending. It's very, very irritating to try to defend Zerg drop, especially once they get crackling. Jaedong, being shown there, knows, okay, here comes the big droopy siege tank attack. He's got Vessel, and he's probably going to do some sort of bulldog maneuver where he drops ultras on top of the pack of tanks, because if you just try to move into this many tanks, your army will disappear. Even Dark Swarm to some extent is mitigated by an army like this, because it's hard to get the swarms in the right spots because of all the splash. So Jaedong massing up honorably here, trying to get everything loaded up into Overlords. Looks like he has freaking 200 supply worth of Overlords here. And he wants to go in on the ground and in the air, and he's screaming in here eastbound with the Ultras, dropping from the Overlords, one of which is irradiated. Fantasy's westbound tanks get absolutely butchered, but a lot of Zerg stuff gets eaten up as well. Jaedong is trying to drop on top. He gets a Plague and a Dark Swarm on the rest of the tanks. Ultras coming in, hammering the tanks, and we're going to see here how strong Fantasy is as he's trying to run away from the lurkers under Dark Swarm. Remember, it's very hard to get your stuff from point A to point B in Brood War because of the fact that, well, you can't just have your army on one hotkey, 1A, 2A, 3A, and there are no multiple building select. This Fantasy is going to get sandwiched here as he was trying to go northbound, but he sort of ran out of steam and he calls GG. So the Dong there at the peak of his powers takes down Fantasy to make it 3-1 in favor of Fantasy's team. So if you're wondering how the rest of this Pro League series went, Jaedong won the following game and beat an incredible ace of the SK team, and that was Bisu. And he had to face off against the guy S2 in the ace match, whose only freaking job on the roster was to get him out. He's like the left-handed specialist in baseball, like Mike Myers, and Jaedong is like Jason Giambi, and Jaedong beat S2 for the reverse sweep. So this was like the flashpoint of the series where Fantasy played Jaedong. Hope you enjoyed it. Sub for more. Check out the playlist.